I'm Catherine Ross, and I am the person in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division, centrally in Church House, Westminster, who leads on environmental matters. And thank you for joining us today. This session is focusing on church buildings and specifically a vision for a zero carbon church. This session is very much a practical bricks and mortar session. Joe and I sort of have a semi-serious joke between us. I lead on bricks and mortar and she leads on hearts and minds. So you probably know we've got other webinars in this series that Joe takes on how to form your team and on action planning. And then I run this one and the one on defining and measuring net zero. So this next hour is very much about approaches to cutting emissions from your church building. The church shown here in this photograph is St Michael All Angels, Withington. It's a grade 1 listed beautiful Norman church, and it also has a very good claim to being Britain's first zero carbon church. They reached that point through a combination of energy reduction and renewable energy generation with a biomass boiler and 24 solar PV panels. And the fact that it looks exactly like any other beautiful rural church is why I choose to start with it, because people often think that zero carbon has to look modern and intrusive and that there's an immediate conflict with our precious heritage, but it doesn't need to be like that. I suspect we're all familiar with these things by now, but just in case, there's something you can click within the view options at the top of the screen. If you go for side by side, it tends to show up the slides better. If you mute your microphone, or otherwise Joe might well have done everyone anyway, just to stop the background noise, and put your questions into the chat box. Joe will keep an eye on them as we go along, and if it's something she can answer straight away, she will, or otherwise we'll come back to them at the end. So in terms of today's session, what I'll cover: why zero carbon, what is zero carbon anyway, what we know about our start point, and then the most of the time is about the vision of a zero carbon church and the practical path to get there. Some first steps you can be looking at around gathering data and challenging some myths about our buildings. Next steps and questions at the end. Very quickly, why zero carbon? The context of everything that I say today is that we have a climate crisis and we have an associated ecological crisis and a real urgency to act on those things. The key report that is often quoted is the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who put this report out October 2018. That was a summary of a huge quantity of scientific analysis and made it very clear that globally, mankind had to halve emissions by 2030 and get to net zero carbon by 2050 if we are to have a reasonable probability of staying below 1.5 degrees of global heating. General Synod have called for all parts of the church to move much faster than that. They have set us a prophetic challenge of planning for net zero by 2030. And that is firmly rooted in our mission, the 5 marks of mission. The 5th one, to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. In this context, that's about cutting down, seriously reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and offsetting the rest so that we as a church are not contributing to man-made climate change. And because climate change and its terrible impacts are so closely linked with climate justice, you can make a very strong argument that having a more environmentally sound approach to how we run the church also weaves right through the other marks of mission. What is zero carbon? When we talk about zero carbon, what do we mean? So for a typical church building, if you take the energy use of that building, so the oil, the gas, the electricity, and you multiply it by a set of standard conversion factors, and you add to that the fuel, so petrol and diesel, from reimbursable travel, again multiplied by standard conversion factors, then that will give you the majority of a church's gross carbon footprint. And these conversion factors are issued by the government every year, they're updated every year, and they're a standard amount that you multiply, for example, a litre of oil by to give you the associated greenhouse gas emission. From your gross carbon footprint, you can remove 2 things, one of which is 100% renewable electricity, and the other is any valid carbon offset or sequestration. The carbon offsets are when you're paying to reduce carbon somewhere else. They're sort of a form of trade. So you're funding a project somewhere else in the world that's reducing greenhouse gases in that place. That might be about cleaner cooking stoves, or energy efficiency of buildings, or transportation. Whereas sequestration is about capturing carbon for the long term in solid or liquid form. So in our church context, that might be through nature-based solutions such as planting trees, increasing vegetation, or improving soils of church land. And once you remove those things from your gross carbon footprint, that's what gives you your net carbon footprint. And it's this net carbon footprint that we have been challenged by General Synod to get to zero by 2030. In terms of how we define what's in scope and out of scope, and how we might go about measuring it for the Church of England, I have a separate webinar just on that topic. So I'm not going to go into it in detail in this session. Guidance has been issued nationally about what we think should be in scope and about how we think it should be measured. And that definition is currently out for consultation with dioceses and cathedrals and other consultees to make sure that we've got the definition and the approach correct. And if you want to know more about that, then please do come to the webinar on that subject. But one key part of that definition is important to understand in the context of today's session on our buildings is about the difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. So operational carbon is what we use when we run our buildings, our heating and our lighting once the buildings are in operation. Whereas embodied carbon is what's locked away, what we've used to build it. So the steels, the bricks, the stone, the light fitting. And at the moment, in that net zero definition, embodied carbon is out of scope of the 2030 target and would be in a second phase of work, whereas operational carbon is in scope. That's a really knotty issue, and it's one of the things the consultation is asking people to give us feedback on. But it's important to remember in the context of today's talk that whilst embodied carbon might not be measured and part of that definition by 2030, we need to have it in our minds when we're thinking about our building project. Is what are the energy and resources it takes to intervene in our buildings, and what benefit will it give us afterwards, and making sure that those two are in balance. What do we know about our start point? The baseline survey that was last done was in 2012, and it showed us that our total carbon footprint was somewhere between 600,000 and 1 million tonnes of CO2 as a church as a whole, and it showed us where our carbon footprint was coming from. So just over half coming from our schools, secondary schools and primary schools, around 2/5 from our churches, and then the rest from a combination of clergy housing, offices and cathedrals. We only have less than 5,000 schools, and we've got more than 15,000 churches. But the reason schools make up such a chunk of our carbon footprint is because the heat and the light is on for the majority of the week, and we're heating those buildings to a temperature suitable for children. Another important piece of information to understand about where we start from is how much we already spend on our buildings as a church. So this is from the 2019 financial returns from churches. And if you then look at how much we're spending on utilities, major repairs and new buildings every year, utilities over 34 million, major repairs 128 million, and new builds 60 million. So the question that's in everyone's mind about how are we going to pay for these projects, part of the answer to that is it's about how we do these projects we're already doing, how we plan our repairs, how we plan our new building projects that we're already doing, that we're already fundraising for. Making sure when we do these repairs and make these changes to our buildings that we're taking environmental factors into account. And then by doing that, this utility bill figure should go down over time. The current process of energy audits that we've been doing has shown us how widely energy use varies from church to church. So this is a sample of 80 churches and halls, looking at their total energy usage. The orange is the gas or oil, and the blue is electricity. The green line is the average. And what you can see is this really, really long tail of low energy using churches, churches which already have a very low carbon footprint. They're probably only turning on their heating for 3 hours, 5 hours a week, and they're lighting the same. So they're not using very much energy. And then you have this kind of middle set of churches here, and then a group of really busy, high energy using churches on the right-hand side. And this graph points to what I'm going to come to later about the practical path to net zero, and that you need different solutions, different interventions, depending on how much energy the church is already using. And the energy audits also tell us something else that's very important about where we need to focus, which is on heating. So this is an analysis of 38 churches and halls, breaking down their annual energy use into heating, lighting, and other. And you can see that 72% is from the heating. So when we're thinking as a diocese, where do we begin? The place to begin is with your highest energy using buildings, because that's where, if you can bring in a reduction, it'll have the most impact. And the place to focus is on heating, because that is where the majority of energy use is going. Our energy audit process also has given us some really useful information about the most common areas for action. So our energy audit process has been going on through Parish 5 for the last year, but before that in some dioceses like Leeds and Oxford, going back for a couple of years, and before that. And I have a master's student currently who's getting all of the results of those energy audits and putting them into a massive spreadsheet so that we can do this kind of analysis. And at the moment we've got 86. By the end of that project, we'll know about the results of 150 audits. And we're grouping the recommendations into standard categories and looking at how often they come up. So what does that tell us? The most common recommendation, 81 out of the 86 reports, is about switching to 100% renewable. And I would almost put money on it that the other 5 churches, it's because they already have. And that's because this is the simplest thing that a church can do if it wants to cut its net carbon footprint. Now, switching to renewable isn't reducing the amount of energy that you use. So it's not reducing your gross carbon footprint, but it is reducing your net carbon footprint because your electricity is coming from renewable sources. The second most common recommendation from energy audits is around lighting, and particularly where there are easy switches that can be made to swap an existing light bulb for an LED light bulb. We know from that pie chart I just showed you that lighting is actually a relatively small percentage of the energy use in a church, but it's an easy area to tackle. It's relatively quick, relatively simple to make those changes. Often, if you're just changing bulbs for bulbs, you don't need faculty, and it pays back relatively quickly. So whilst the total amount of energy use on lighting might be small, it's an area you can make progress on quickly. After those two, the majority of the findings from the energy audit process is about heating in one way or another. So that can be around heat loss. So we're looking here at draft proofing and insulation and glazing. Or it can be about making your existing heating system run as well and for as long as possible. So that's sorting out your heating controls, optimizing your heating settings, the efficiency and longevity through things like sludge filters and antifreeze. And then after that, looking at things like changing your heating system to a new one, or where there isn't a way to move away from fossil fuels, at least making sure that you have a new and efficient gas boiler. All of that information from that whole process helps us start to develop our vision of a zero carbon church. So here's my zero carbon church. It's quite a simple drawing. You can see that it's the best I could do on PowerPoint. We have our zero carbon church, and they want to make changes. Where are they going to start? So first off, let's establish some principles. So our zero carbon church principles, the first is that it is well maintained. That might not be where you would expect me to start, but it's absolutely vital. It's well maintained. There aren't holes in the roof. There aren't holes in the windows. It is wind tight to the degree that it reasonably can be, and it is watertight. Otherwise, the heat that's coming out of your heating system will simply be disappearing out of holes in the fabric, and the air inside will be damp and harder to heat. The second principle is about buying renewables, because it is the simplest thing that we can do to make a change. The third is wasting less. So wasting less electricity, gas, oil, and all of the other resources it takes to run the church. The fourth is where you can, where it's possible, switching away from fossil fuel-based heating on gas and oil toward modern electric heating. And because you're getting your electricity from renewables, you've therefore made your heating net zero. The fifth is, again, where appropriate, generating electricity on site through solar and other renewables. And then finally, and very much finally, offsetting the rest. For running a zero carbon church, here are some principles. The first is having really clear and simple and well understood systems so that the users of the building know how the heating works, know how the lighting works, and can make simple changes. That the heating and lighting is zoned if you have a building with more than one part, that it's zoned and you're only using it where you need it. That somebody is regularly monitoring the energy use and feeding that information back. And that when you're buying something, you're taking sustainability into account. What's our end result then? We aim to have a comfortable and welcoming place to be. That's also a cool sanctuary during the hotter summers, which we know are coming. And where you have lower utility bills. And then in the future, looking ahead to the future of our zero carbon church, it's very likely that carbon taxes will be brought in one form or another. And if we can tackle these issues now, we'll have lower carbon taxes in the future. Our buildings already start with some real advantages. Many of our buildings have high solar gain because they have big windows, so that's a natural form of warming for the building inside. We have a high thermal mass from the solid stone walls which retain heat. And a lot of our buildings have grounds around them where we can do planting, tree planting or vegetation. And many of our buildings were built a long time ago from local materials, and so they have a very low embodied carbon. So given all of that, what might we do to create our zero carbon church? What kind of features might we see? What I'm going to show you is a whole range of possibilities, but please remember, we would never expect to see everything on one church. I'm going to show you a menu to choose from. You won't be ordering every dish. What is right for a particular church will need to be worked out on a case-by-case basis. It'll be affected by the type and hours of use, by whether the building's listed, whether it has historic interiors, what the structure is of the building, does it have good gas and electrical connections, and many other factors. So please have that in mind. You'll know the buildings that you deal with, and look at the menu I'm going to present you, and you'll know which bits might be relevant. It's also important to remember up front that most of the things I'm going to show you require faculty. And in my experience, it's hugely beneficial if a church speaks to their DAC really early on in the process to work out what is right for them. So, our church. The first thing I would start with is a well-maintained roof. Again, maintenance, making sure that the heating of the system, that the heating that you're getting from your existing system is not disappearing out the roof, and that damp is not coming in. And well-maintained gutters so that they're not overtopping and having damp coming down the walls and penetrating the building. Then if you have floodlights, if you have path lights, that those will be run with energy efficient bulbs. Draft proofing around doors. That can be complex, but looking for solutions, there's a whole variety of different solutions for different types of doors. And again, it's a complex topic, but looking for solutions to reduce the heat loss through your windows in an appropriate way. And then it's starting to look at new technologies. So for some churches, that's about having a heat pump, an air source or a ground source heat pump. Those run like a fridge in reverse, taking heat from the air or ground outside and using a pump and a heat exchanger to warm up the air or water circulating inside the church. And then solar panels to create electricity. For some churches, it can be appropriate to be thinking about insulating renders or external insulation. Water butts to capture that spare water and use it in the church grounds. And then in the car park, bike racks, and EV car charging. Again, as I said at the beginning, we wouldn't expect to see everything here on one building, but it's the kind of features you would be looking at in a zero carbon church. What does the inside of our zero carbon church look like? Well, first off, as you come in, you'd expect to see internal doors or a draft curtain, something that's stopping the cold air coming in with you. Second, you'd expect to see low carbon heating solutions. There's a variety of those, but for example, pew heaters, where it's electric heating and it's very localized where people are sitting. You might well see things like rugs and cushions and hanging, which are allowing people to keep their body heat and not lose it to the surfaces around them. Electric panel heaters, for example, far infrared radiant panel heaters, again, another form of efficient electric heating. You would expect the lighting would be run with energy efficient LEDs, and that if there is a loft void or if the church is re-roofing, they would have looked at insulation. For many churches, there can be solutions around partitioning to create smaller spaces and then keep those spaces warm. Service times potentially varying with the seasons. This is something that used to happen a lot in the past, is that in the winter, the service would be later in the day than in the summer, so that by the afternoon, the sunshine would have come in through the windows and warmed the building. Heating and lighting zoned and timed, and that timing is well set for the usage of the building. Low flush toilets, energy efficient kitchen appliances. And if you've got that solar panel array on the roof, you might find battery storage inside the building. I'm not going to touch very much on a biodiverse church, but just to skim past it, because it's useful to think about the positive benefits of the space around our church. So things like the existing trees being protected or new trees planted, bat boxes, swift boxes, veg beds, wildflower areas and wildlife areas. It's hard to measure the beneficial aspects of these kinds of interventions, but we know all of these things will help address the climate and ecological emergencies and be beneficial to the church community. So there's so much there that I've just thrown at you. It's important to think, well, where would we begin? So that's why we've developed the practical path to net zero. 2 sides of A4 that summarises a huge amount of information. And if you haven't already, you can find it on our website, and I'll put a link in the chat at the end. And the practical path to net zero breaks it down into these 4 steps. Where do we start? What next? Getting to zero, and only if. And the where do we start actions, these are the kind of things you'd expect every church to consider, even the low energy using churches on the left-hand side of my graph at the beginning. What next are the kind of things you move on to if you're a medium energy using church, perhaps used 3 to 4 times a week. Getting to zero are those bigger projects, bigger interventions in the building, which you would only really be considering if you were a busy and high energy using church. And then the only if are things in particular circumstances. So the where do we start? I'm going to say it again: maintaining the roof, the gutters, the broken windows. Insulating our pipes, dealing with drafts, rugs, floor coverings and cushions, 100% renewable electricity, matching the heating timings well to the use of the building, and it can really help with that to get timers and smart controllers. Making sure if you have radiators that they will last as long as possible and be efficient through things like antifreeze and anti-sludge filters. The easy LED replacement for your lights. And last but not least are behavioural changes, so that turning things off, it's potentially having an energy champion within your church who's checking the meters and then talking about that at the PCC meetings. It's about having a procurement policy. Then the what next? So those bigger actions that you might think about if you're a medium energy using church. And as we start to move into these bigger projects, pretty much everything here will require faculty, and pretty much everything here will require advice, because you will need to know as a church how to do it correctly in your situation and avoid maladaptation. And the first of those is a really good example of that, about insulating easy to access lofts. When done right, this can be a really good way of reducing heat loss. But when done incorrectly, it can cause condensation and damage the wooden beams. So it's really important to get good advice and choose the materials well if you're looking to insulate. The second is around partitioning off those smaller areas that you can keep warm. Installing a draft lobby or a glazed door, something that's going to cut down the heat loss from the door. If you've got someone on your PCC who feels confident doing this, then you can get Dataloggers, which are very low cost devices which measure the temperature and the humidity in the building, and then you leave them around the building and you can find out how your building performs. Sorting out the zoning in the building, so if you've got different sections, having separate zones with thermostatic radiator valves or other controls on them. Making sure that your boiler temperature is set correctly, especially if you have a condensing boiler. And then for some churches, particularly if you've got visitors that drop in, often churches are leaving their lighting on the whole time, and instead you can swap to having thermal or motion sensors, which turn the lights on when they're needed. Those can also be good in kitchens and bathrooms. And then perhaps most importantly in this list is thinking through the potential to replace your gas or oil space heating with electric solutions such as pew or panel heaters to move you away from fossil fuels. So then there are bigger interventions with getting to zero. And these are things that generally you'll only be thinking about if you're one of those high energy using churches at the right-hand side of the graph. Everything here is going to require faculty, and you're going to want really good advice from your quinquennial architect or from your DAC. The first of those is tackling the windows. Well, two different ways of tackling windows, through draft proofing and through secondary and double glazing when we're talking about suitable windows. So places like your offices, your church hall, potentially your vestry. Church windows are very precious things, and custom cabinetry for the main church windows is extremely expensive. So generally what we're talking about here is those smaller windows or more modern windows in busier areas of the building. If you have a tower that's basically acting as a chimney, so the warm air within the church is going up the tower, then one thing to consider is draft proofing the tower ceiling. And similarly, if you still have pew platforms, one thing to consider can be insulating underneath those pew platforms. And then also there might be suitable areas, perhaps your church hall, perhaps your office, where you want to look at internal insulation to keep those rooms warmer. One thing that some churches are starting to consider is reinstating ceilings where they have had them at some time in their past. We have a church working through our faculty system at the moment, and they originally looked at doing this because they have an issue with bats, and by reinstating the ceiling they'll be able to keep the bats above and keep them away from the people below. But they're also combining that with insulating that ceiling, so solving two problems in one go. And then solar PV panels for some churches where it's suitable, where the structure of the roof is right, where visibly it would be appropriate. That can be a very good way to generate renewable electricity on site. And then new lighting systems. So we had those easy LED replacements earlier on the path. This is where you're actually having to look at substantial changes to the lighting system itself. Then our only ifs in particular circumstances. So for example, if you're re-roofing, that's the perfect moment to think about insulation. If you've got a cavity, if that's the age of your building, then looking at cavity wall insulation. If you've got a really suitable building and a busy building, then external renders can be a good way of protecting and insulating the building. If you've got a building that's used all week round, heat pumps can be a really good solution, but they run at a lower temperature, so they're very good for kind of a lower level background heating that's on throughout the week, which is why I would say they're suitable for those churches which are busy throughout the week and using quite a lot of energy. And then if you're a busy all week round church and you're doing work on your floor anyway, those are the kind of circumstances where we might think about underfloor heating in combination, if possible, with a heat pump. Then there's the issue of new gas boilers. So what I would say to you here is not to leave it until the last minute, have your boiler break down and then replace gas with gas without thinking that through. Is please plan ahead and do your options appraisal and work out if there's a way that you can move away from fossil fuels. If you can, to a heat pump, to heating panels, to pew heating. If you can't do that, if you've gone through that options appraisal and really the other potential solutions aren't viable, that's the kind of time when you would think about a new gas boiler. Because a new gas boiler will be better than an old gas boiler and certainly better than an oil boiler. But the reality is that if you put in a new gas boiler now, you'll probably still be using it 20 years from now. So you've locked your church into fossil fuels way past that 2030 deadline. And one last thing is if you have a significant amount of car use, particularly from the community, then you might want to think about EV charging points in your church car park. That doesn't reduce your own energy use, but it does help your community transition from petrol and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles. So how much does all of that cost? The energy audits are helping us work out a very rough cost of moving toward net zero. It varies enormously from church to church, but I can show you some averages that are coming out of the energy audit process. For a church to do all of the steps in that step A on the practical path to net zero costs somewhere around 10 to 15,000. Again, it varies so much depending on what's needed at your church, but let's say 10 to 15,000. But much of that is needed anyway for basic maintenance because it's about the roof and the gutters and the windows. And our average Sunday church is paying about £2,000 a year on utility bills. Doing all of the steps in step A will cut their energy use by about 50%. So that means they'll pay back in 10 to 15 years. So not quick, but the payback will come. And at that point, the remaining carbon footprint of a Sunday church is going to be somewhere around 6 tons of CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent. At the moment, if you choose to offset through climate stewards, their carbon price is £20 per tonne. So this remaining carbon footprint would cost the church around £120 a year to offset. So very roughly, as an average, to give you a sense of it, the cost for our Sunday church to get to net zero will be about £10,000 to £15,000 up front and about £120 a year. The energy audits then give us an indicative cost of some bigger projects. So I'll look back at these in a second, but I just wanted to be clear on two caveats first. The first important caveat is these prices that are coming out of the energy audits are for specific churches where the auditors have gone in, reviewed all of the buildings and the systems, and are recommending that this intervention is correct in that building. So if it had actually cost 3 times more because of something to do with the building, they probably wouldn't have recommended it. And the other thing is that the prices in the energy audits exclude professional advice, planning and scaffolding. And we all know that for some of these things, for example, solar panels, the scaffolding cost will be a noticeable sum. But with those two caveats, I think it's still useful to have a rough sense of how much it might cost for these interventions and a rough sense of what the carbon saving would be. So heat pumps are potentially a very high carbon saving. Under pew heating, about a quarter of the greenhouse gas emissions. Solar panels similarly. Replacing the boiler about 12% and insulation about 10%. But again, remember these caveats. It's not saying that in any church anywhere you could do it for these prices. It's saying in these churches where the energy auditors think this is the right intervention to make, this is what they think it will cost. A good first place to start for any church is knowing where you're starting from. So the Church of England Energy Footprint Tool is now live, and it gives you the carbon footprint of energy use in your church. Please, if you haven't already done it, please complete the EFT, or encourage any churches that you deal with to complete the EFT. When a church goes on, they go onto their online parish return system like they do every year to complete their finance returns, and they start submission. And now they'll find a third box with the EFT. They click in and they enter their data around their utility bills, the size of the building and the usage of the building. And wherever possible, if we already hold that information somewhere in Church House on another system, it'll be pre-computed. And then they'll click through and they'll get their results, their gross carbon footprint, their net carbon footprint, a weather adjusted figure, which is the most comparable one from year to year, and then their energy efficiency per meter squared and per person hour. And this one on the right-hand side is really useful if you have a big, busy church reaching out to its community and it's packed with different groups throughout the week. It might have quite a high gross carbon footprint, but it should come out really well on this measure of efficiency per person hour. Another really good thing to do, if you have someone in your PPC who feels competent and confident to do this, is to buy a handful of Dataloggers. They cost, depending on the brand you buy, somewhere between £40 and £80 each. And they're a little stick like this that plugs into your laptop. And what you do is you leave them around the building in different places, leave one outside so it gets the ambient temperature. And over the course of a fortnight or a month, as your heating system clicks on and clicks off, The data logger will measure what the temperature is and what the humidity is. And then you can gather them all up and look at the analysis and find out what it tells you about how your building responds in different locations around the building to the heating system. Let's challenge a few myths in this area. The first of those is that new buildings are more sustainable. When we think about a zero carbon building, what pops into mind is probably a passive house or something like that. Let's challenge that myth for a second and think about a church like this, St. Martin, Canterbury. It's been used continuously as a church since at least the 6th century and was originally built using a lot of recycled Roman brick. So we have a building here that is still fulfilling the original purpose for which it was built hundreds of years later. And we have so many buildings like this around the country where we can be proud that we have these sustainable buildings that are still doing what they were built for centuries later. And how many modern buildings that are being put up now will be able to claim that several centuries from now? And so I would hold on to this really important principle that the most sustainable building is the one that has already been built. All the embodied carbon has already been invested in that building. So the question is about how do we keep that building alive? How do we adapt it so that it can continue to be used and we don't end up in a situation where one building is taken down and another one built with all of those additional materials. The second myth is that it's all about solar panels on roofs. And instead I would say to you that the place to start is reducing heat loss and making the heating and lighting more efficient. So many of you, I'm sure, will have seen thermal imaging camera photographs before. Red is where it's warm, blue is where it's cold. This is the bottom of a church door. And you can see clear as day the cold air coming in through under this church door. Reducing heat loss and making the heating and lighting more efficient is the first place to start. Solar panels are the icing on the cake once you've made sure that your building is not leaking energy. Which said, in the right place, renewables are absolutely part of the solution. This is an installation on the top of Gloucester Cathedral. And this map shows you, every dot on this map is where there has been an installation of renewables of one kind or another on a Church of England church. And you can find this map in the Church Heritage Record if you search for renewables. And this map really shows you that the answer to this myth, which is it's impossible to get permission. Every dot here is an installation. When I speak to my colleagues who look after the casework that comes to the Church Buildings Council and to the Cathedral Fabric Commission of England, what they tell me is that very few cases are turned down, but that very few churches and cathedrals currently are asking for things that push the boundaries. We've just recently got approval for solar panels here on the cloisters of Salisbury Cathedral. So what I'd like to kind of say to you today is that culture is changing. So the Church Buildings Council and the Cathedral Fabric Commission of England have issued a joint statement about sustainability in the environment and how important it is for them to take that into account in their decision making. We've had very positive conversations with the amenity societies and ongoing conversations with Historic England. And it's not that there's a magic answer and things will change overnight, but all of those organisations are very conscious of the fact that there is a climate crisis. And that as heritage organisations, they need to think through our response to that. And that will mean change over time, particularly that those, a church that might have got a marginal no in the past, if they make the right case, could get a marginal yes now. The next myth is that nothing can be done without spending lots of money. So I showed you before, there are big interventions that do spend a lot of money, but not everything is like that. So for example, this thermal imaging photograph shows a pew after these 5 people have just got up and walked away. And the picture is so clear, isn't it? These people arrived in the church feeling warm. They had their body heat. They sat down on this pew and all of their body heat has gone into the wood and through their feet into the stone floor in front of them. So a really cost-effective solution here would be a pew cushion and then a runner on the floor here. If my head of conservation was here on the call, I know she would say that any runners on the floor should be breathable, so not rubber backed. Otherwise you get condensation underneath them that damages the floor. This is a picture of a church radiator with a great big build-up of sludge in the middle, which means it can't work effectively. This is a photograph showing that somebody has taken the time and effort to beautifully lag all of these pipes, but not here around the air and dirt circle. So it's glowing hot. It's trying to heat up the boiler cupboard. And this is a church which has invested in underfloor heating, but the chairs are over here on the side. So the people here aren't getting any benefit from that warm area. And then this photograph is just for amusement, really. It is a toilet that has been plumbed into the hot water rather than the cold, which is why it is glowing red. It's just to make the point that there are things which can be done without spending a fortune. The fifth myth is that space heating the whole church is the right start point. We're just so used to it. We think that it's normal. We think that space heating our whole church is normal because that's what's been done for our lifetime. But if you just stop and think about it, we all know that hot air rises. We know it. And we can look at these thermal imaging photographs and see it clear as day, the heat rising up to the ceiling. And we all know that burning fossil fuels is contributing to global heating and climate change. And yet our basic start point at the moment, when we think about how to heat our buildings, is that we burn fossil fuels, oil or gas, in a cupboard somewhere in our building, and then we try and heat up all of the air, and it has to go all the way up into the ceiling and then come back down until it gets to the people sitting at the bottom. And so what we need to start doing is challenging that as our basic start point, and instead focus on how are we going to make people comfortable and conserve our historic interiors, and make that our start point. And whenever we're making decisions about heating one of our buildings, is think, how are we going to make people comfortable that use our building, and how are we going to conserve our historic interior? And if we can do that, it will have two benefits for us. Moving from space heating to more efficient, let's call it people heating, will use less energy and therefore cut our gross carbon footprint. But also many of these solutions are electric, which we can therefore combine with purchasing 100% renewables and cut our net carbon footprint. Which leads us on to myth 6, that electric heating is always expensive and inconvenient. And I would say it really doesn't need to be. So for example, pew heaters. Under pew heaters, heat the people, not the spaces, and that reduces the amount of time that you need to run your heating for. These brown panels here and these white panels here on the aisle ceiling of this church in Chalgrove are far infrared radiant panel heaters. And they give out a form of perfectly safe radiation that warms up the surfaces that it touches. So it's not trying to heat up the air, it's warming the surfaces. So you don't have that problem with hot air rising. And these panels can be particularly useful if you have a part of your church that you need to be warm quite responsively at specific times of the week. So maybe you have a choir up at the altar on a Tuesday evening, or you have a parent and toddler group on a Thursday morning in one of the side aisles, that you can install some of these panels and just have that area be warm for that time of the week without running the whole church heating. And then another option for electric heating is around heat pumps, as we mentioned earlier, either air source or ground source heat pumps. Those can be combined with radiators, or they can be combined with underfloor heating. And they are an effective and efficient form of electric heating. But because, as I said earlier, they run at a lower temperature than a conventional boiler, they're not responsive in the way that a normal heating system is. So you want them to be running at a gradual, gentle background heat over a long period of time, which is why they're more effective for those busy churches up the right-hand side of our graph. Next steps. So for those of you who've joined from individual churches, unsurprisingly, the place I would say to start is complete the energy footprint tool. Go online and fill in the EFT. It should only take you 5 minutes if you've rounded up your utility bill. The next is to swap to renewable electricity. And then find on our website, I'll try and remember to put the links in the chat if Joe hasn't already, the links to energy efficiency measures and the practical path to net zero. And then have a look at the Eco Church survey and find the buildings section of that survey and complete it. It's a really useful framework for thinking in this context about your building. More widely, Eco Church is a really useful framework for thinking about how you can move your church forward environmentally. And the combination of all of these should allow you to develop an action plan for your building. Another thing I'd ask you to consider is whether you want a motion to go to your PCC answering the call from General Synod to move toward net zero by 2030. And for those of you joining from dioceses, it's a very similar list, encouraging uptake of the, that should say uptake, and it does say uptake, I've never noticed that. Anyway, encouraging uptake of the energy footprint tool across your diocese, encourage switching to 100% renewables. And then again, finding energy efficiency measures and the practical path to net zero, but also we have guidance on our heating principles. And then use that to develop a sustainability policy for your DAC. Gloucester DAC has already written one, and it's a really useful start point. And then have a think about the skills of the advisors on your DAC. Do you have any gaps about heating and renewables? And if so, how might you be able to fill those? And then hopefully all of that information will allow you to develop an action plan for your diocese if you haven't already got one. And then again, for those dioceses that haven't already done this, will you be bringing a motion to your diocesan synod answering the call from General Synod about planning for net zero by 2030? And then finally, the net zero consultation process is currently open. If you're joining from a diocese, hopefully you already know about that, and the deadline is August 17th. And there's a lot more information about that if you join the webinar on defining and measuring net zero. Which brings me on beautifully to saying, please do come along to our other net zero webinars if you haven't already. Joe and I have recently added some more dates, so if you had had a look and there wasn't one that suited you, have another look.